This is LMSU, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined...
And it's Frankie Muscovich here as Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion.
What's going on?
Seizing power.
This is an unsanctioned intervention.
It sure is, Menzel. And that's because I think without said unforecasted intervention, Mr. Menzel might not make an effort to introduce himself appropriately to our dear listeners because...
Well, I have introduced myself. I've alerted listeners that I am Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land.
That's right, but that's not the whole truth of it, is it there, Menzel?
It kind of is.
We need... No, well, you know... To an extent, I think with Menzel's reluctance there, he probably knows I've interjected myself to celebrate you and to advise our lovely listenership that in case they did not see this on the interwebs in the last week, although you'd have to be living under a rock, guys, we need to congratulate you on being appointed to the board of AEMO. That's a big deal. Congratulations, Menzel.
The Australian Energy Market Operator.
That's right.
Now, partly operated by co-host of this podcast, Luke Menzel.
I'm not sure that's entirely how the governance of AEMO works, but sure, let's...
Oh, details.
Details.
Those details are your problem now, Luke.
That's right.
Indeed. Me and the 1,900-odd folk that work for AEMO, sure.
That work for you.
You're already getting me in trouble. Thank you both. That's very kind. It is indeed a great honour to have the trust of energy ministers around the country put in me, appointed to the board of AEMO after a very extensive process, a very robust interview process that I passed through along with a number of others. And yes, really happy to be appointed along with fellow incoming board member Joseph Tadich from Tesla. Our first board meeting is just a couple of weeks away, and I can report the induction process that AEMO is putting us through is incredibly extensive. I'm being put through my paces and having all manner of new information inserted into the old noggin. Neo in the Matrix style plug insertion into the back of my brain with the downloaded information. That's not specifically what's happening. AEMO may have boffins working on that technology somewhere, but that's certainly what it feels like.
So you have to learn Kung Fu the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Now I need to fashion up a meme for you as like the superhero avatar of energy efficiency and electrification.
You really don't.
Into the Matrix. I think that sounds like a fun afternoon with generative image making in AI.
I would like to point out I am an incoming board member on a well-established board. Ably chaired by Mary O'Kane, and I'm looking forward to connecting to and learning from my fellow directors. No superhero antics here, Muscovich, but I will say that I'm obviously excited to make a contribution and bring my particular perspective to the boardroom table and to the deliberations of AEMO, because, as we've said once or twice on this podcast, demand side and how it evolves pretty damn important to the energy transition. So I'll look forward to making that contribution. And it will have some implications for how we deal with papers that hail from the good ship AEMO in the future. I might need to invoke our self-dealing framework and recuse myself from those particular discussions. But we'll get to that in due course.
We will. We look forward to seeing your contributions manifest in the world of real energy policy making, and we will boot you from any relevant conversations on this here podcast.
With obsequious respect.
That's right.
We will boot you. Oh, all-powerful Luke.
As always. But Congrats again, Menzel. It's great news.
Thank you. I appreciate that. May I introduce you now?
If you must.
We are joined, of course, by Global Vice President for Marketing, Extortion and Embarrassing Luke at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am ticking all relevant KPIs this afternoon with particular delight as it relates to you. So it's lovely to be with you on Gadigal Country.
And a man who recently proved that his culinary skills extend to a pretty mean Neapolitan pizza. It is Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Well, I'm glad that I passed the pizza test. I take my pizza seriously, and I was delighted to bake not just a couple of good Neapolitan pizzas, but the pizza that Chris Bianco, reputedly the world's greatest pizzaiolo, describes as a metaphor for himself, which inspires eye-rolling from my partner and patting of hands on tummy from me in anticipation of eating that Rosa al Bianco pizza, which is pretty good.
It was pretty great.
Can attest. On this week's show, we consider a paper that says fossil fuel markets and infrastructure have a minimum viable scale that could make it hard to execute a seamless handoff to clean energy resources. But first, the war being waged on Iran by the United States and Israel is having a range of profound impacts: humanitarian, geopolitical and economic. And when it comes to the economy, it is spiking global oil and gas prices that pose a potentially calamitous threat. Of course, much rests on how long the war goes on for, but given that discerning the Trump administration's objectives means engaging in a game of choose-your-own-truth social post, it is pretty tricky to predict where this will all land. Right, Tennant?
Yeah, it really, really is. And so, dear listener, when you are listening to this, you already know more than we do about what did happen in the course of what will be 4 or 5 days gap. As we record, what has happened is the war continues. Energy prices are spiking in many places. It is very clear that a lot is unclear about how this will proceed, what could happen next, how long it all might last. So stick a honking big asterisk on almost everything that we're all about to say, because predictions are difficult, especially about the future, as many people have been credited with saying. That said, so far, the sequence of events as it pertains to energy and climate is, of course, the commencement of the war a week ago, and I think we can all just call it a war. There's been some semantic gymnastics from the Trump administration about what to call it. I think if you're blowing up this much stuff and this many people and boats and what have you, I think that's a war. It follows, it depends on how far back you really want to go, but a long period of tensions, but the actual immediate onset of it, a bit of a surprise in all kinds of ways, and it has led to the direct disruption of Iran's own oil output and processing, and in the last 24 hours, as we record some of Iran's own most critical oil refining facilities have been blown up, or at least set on fire in a very spectacularly catastrophic way. Iran has responded with attacks on many of its neighbours, all hosts of US military facilities or forces or cooperators to some degree, although some of them relatively friendly to Iran, still getting some attacks on their territory. That has directly led to the closure of oil and gas production and processing and use operations in much of the Middle East. Most spectacularly, Qatar, the world's, on any given day, maybe the biggest, maybe the second biggest, maybe if Australia's getting a rush of blood to the head. The third biggest exporter of LNG in the world has declared force majeure and stopped shipments of LNG, stopped production of aluminium using smelters powered by gas, stopped production of fertilizer using gas. And that is going to take some time to reverse. However rapidly things resolve themselves in the war. And, of course, Iran's threats of military action have closed or effectively closed. Again, there's semantic gymnastics going on. The Straits of Hormuz, through which 20%, as everyone's been saying, 20% of the world's oil passes through those straits, or did. Now it's waiting on one side of it. And so that is leading to prices spiking. Now, the prices so far have not risen as we speak, and who knows what they've done by the time you're listening. They've not risen as far as in some other crises in recent memory. LNG prices and gas prices have risen substantially in Europe and in North Asia, but they've risen to in the region of 23, 24 Australian dollars per gigajoule. Whereas during the worst single month of the energy crisis that followed the invasion of Ukraine, they averaged more like 100 Australian dollars per megawatt hour. So it could always be worse, and it may yet be. And then oil prices have risen as we speak. They've gone from the sort of 60-ish to 70-ish range where they'd been bouncing around for the last couple of years to $100 a barrel, and market people speculating that if the war keeps going, the extent of production disruption with producers stopping their production at the oil wells because they are running out of storage capacity to keep oil that can't just go onto a tanker because the tankers are full and the tankers aren't going anywhere, that could see oil prices hit more the $150 a barrel mark before too terribly long. We will see. Now, these disruptions are not hitting everywhere. The oil price is going up everywhere. That's an extremely liquid global market, and that is sending petrol prices up. They've risen locally by about 30, 40 cents a litre over the past versus a month ago. And we can expect that to happen pretty much everywhere. But natural gas prices in the United States, they're up only a smidge. In Australia, spot gas prices have actually fallen as we record from about $11 or $12 a gigajoule to $8 a gigajoule. What's going on there? Well, I don't know, but there's no very close immediate connection between those international movements and the local market there. So that also will evolve, and Santos or GLNG sold a spot cargo of LNG for $25 per gigajoule, or very close to that, about 2 weeks. During the course of the week. So the international price movements are going to have an impact, and that will flow through to a lot of things, to airlines, to agriculture through fertilizer prices, through a lot of things. We don't know how long this is going to go on for. We can wave our arms a bit on scenarios for what might happen. But of course, a lot of people are leaping to some version of either this is good for the transition because high fossil prices remind people that there's even more benefits than climate at stake, or this is bad for the transition because people are going to double down on producing more fossils and maintaining security of supply of whatever, and feel worried about trying new things. And I don't know where you two feel enthusiastic between different varieties of arm waving.
I mean, so much is still in flux, right? And we don't like the longer this drags out, the more severe the sort of flow and consequences of all of this might be. So, like, you know, taking that enormous asterisk against this whole conversation and putting it to one side. Gee, it's funny, since we've been doing this podcast, we've had a few occasions to talk about disruptive events like this. One of the ones that came to mind for me, and it's actually one of the earliest reasons that brought the three of us together, was the impact of COVID and just what was potentially playing out there from an energy security perspective, with Ukraine happening at the same time, and at that time a desire to try and not waste the crisis from an energy perspective and see more decisive policy measures put in place that would, have us gear towards more focus on things like energy efficiency and electrification. I think events like this usefully highlight where Australia has really acute vulnerabilities or dependencies from a supply chain perspective. So it's only when things like this come up that you find yourself on the regular talking to people about the really thin kind of liquid fuel storage margins we have in this country because we import most, like 90+% of our oil. We've only got 2 refineries and things like that. But that's been like a well-known thing in energy circles for quite a while. But it's been okay because it's been okay. So I always feel the weight of not wanting to waste the situation that presents itself to push the conversation along around where this transition will have real opportunities for Australia if we reduce our reliance on particular bits of the fossil fuel supply chain that we're talking about here. I also think there's a need to be really sensitive in how you have this conversation when people are like being killed in other countries around the world, and being mindful and sensitive of the human element in all of this. So with all of that said, I do think this is a really significant year from a policy making perspective here. We've got big meaty reviews with things like the safeguard mechanism coming down the line. Much of that will have, and the new vehicle efficiency standard
up for review.
Absolutely, and I think the current crisis playing out with clear eyes should very much bolster the case for ambition and retention or expansion of those policies. I think the risk, and this is where I started with the COVID era of it all, is that you get governments drawn into short-term Band-Aid, either handouts to households to deal with the very real kind of cost impacts of increased fuel prices and things like that, and a failure to think about where that nature of support might be better directed towards the sort of structural longer-term shifts we need to drive. So, I'm looking at you guys thinking about the conversations we were having around Europe's renovation wave that saw billions of euros put into household energy efficiency and electrification measures. And here we saw a lot of money go into energy bill relief for households. And I think we had a lot of conversation at that time around the different uses that could have been put to that might have had a positive impact in a more structural way. that's what's on my mind at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge with all these things is you get these acute shockwaves roll through the global economy, and there's all kinds of things that could plausibly be helpful, but relative to the speed and scale of the shockwave, like they're things that take a lot of time to sort of spin up and roll through. So, I mean, the appropriate reaction to things like this is a policy lens which says, well, this seems to be happening on the regular, right? There's like something like this every, 18 months to 2 years, and that doesn't show any time of letting up anytime soon. So maybe investments that aren't about a reactive policy response to a particular crisis, but a recognition that building more resilience into our energy systems on both the supply and the demand side would be prudent for next time, and that we should be working our way through that in a pretty judicious and sustained way, so that the next time something like this rolls around, we're more resilient to it. I'm reminded of the last conversation that we had in our last opening segment on this podcast, which was US Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who was suggesting to our friends at the IEA that they stick to their knitting and focus on energy security. Well, if one was to focus on energy security in the current moment, the IEA would be doubling down on electrification and renewable analysis, right?
Well, given that Chris Wright is currently very busy, sweaty-facedly appearing on cable news, insisting that one ship passing under heavy military escort through the Straits of Hormuz is situation normal. We're getting this situation back under control, guys. He may be too busy to concede the point, but it's a very good point.
The other thing, I mean, this is a bit of a black hat approach to this conversation, but like as clean energy advocates, I think it's worth looking at these things in a holistic way. Of course, by leaning in, say, on the renewable transition, you are potentially reducing your reliance on one set of problematic supply chains. You're arguably increasing your reliance on another set of problematic supply chains, and there's a lot of folk in the defence and national security community that are really concerned about the reliance on China, for example, for a lot of that clean energy infrastructure, which is just something to be aware of. There's like not necessarily a clean win here. There is complexity to these arguments, and being alive to that complexity when we're engaging these sorts of debates, I think is wise. But I just want to finish by just really highlighting the point you made, Frankie, which is like, this is so complex, and we're talking about the climate and energy part of it because we are a climate and energy podcast, but this is such a sort of diabolical set of circumstances for a part of the world which, already had its fair share of challenges, and the long-suffering Iranian people continue to suffer, and it's just really, really tough. And I suppose it's incumbent on all of us to be sort of always bringing that broader context into these conversations because, you can hop in and make your pet argument of choice when a crisis presents itself, but it's best not to forget that it's an actual crisis and is multidimensional, and there's people dying out there, and taking a moment before hopping onto your hobby horse.
He thoroughly endorsed that message.
I endorse that message, and yet I am eyeing my hobby horse flock and desperately wishing to get on top of them. I would just add on the what should Australia do piece of this, that we already had a conversation going on about a national gas reservation policy, one of whose intentions was to insulate the local Australian energy markets from international energy market turmoil. And the case for doing that is stronger than ever as a result of this, although, that's a major policy reform and a complex one, and not one that will necessarily have its full impact in the next 12 months. But it would be a great shame if we actually succeeded in that insulation and then went, so, well, we don't really mind so much about like how much gas we use for this or that purpose because like we've got plenty and we're paying a disconnected price for it. It will, be a good idea to walk and chew gum on this, to continue to look for all the opportunities to transition the provision of energy services through gas to other ways of providing those energy services where they make good sense, which is in a lot of places, but not all of them at the moment. And if people need any more motivation for that, just think every gigajoule that we don't need locally is a gigajoule that can be supplied to Europe, to Japan, to Korea, to places that are going to be struggling for however long this crisis lasts, amidst an acute and not a form of fossil shrinkage that anybody would actually advocate for. So there, it is a good idea to make those demand side savings now more than ever, alongside putting ourselves just a little further out of the, as you say, unpleasantly regular catastrophic gyrations of international energy markets.
All right. Speaking of fossil phase down, shall we chat about a report?
That sense of theme.
Unfortunately, good timing.
In Australia, there has been much discussion of the potential for a gas network death spiral. Essentially, gas customers leaving the gas network, loading network costs onto a diminishing number of customers, which in turn accelerates the departure of further customers from the network. But what if this is just one example of a broader issue faced by a whole raft of fossil fuel systems and infrastructure? That is the contention of a new paper titled Fossil Energy Minimum Viable Scale, recently published in Science. In it, the authors argue that fossil energy systems from petroleum refineries to coal mines that supply power plants have a minimum viable scale, which they describe as a level of throughput past which existing physical, financial and managerial infrastructures can no longer effectively operate as expected. If the authors are right, this has big implications for the energy transition, as it suggests assumptions that fossil fuel use can and will decline smoothly are both simplistic and optimistic, and that many fossil systems will require very proactive management to phase down and out. It is pretty interesting stuff. Frankie, what did you make of it?
There's a lot that jumps out and speaks to some of the experience that we're already having in this country, right? And so on the one hand, this paper feels very familiar because I found it just an interesting framing for a set of issues that in some places we're already talking about, but importantly in others we're not. So I think this touches on this concept, which is, and I don't know if I've got a good kind of reason for why this isn't being talked about a little bit more consistently. I guess if you're an advocate for climate action, you don't really want to focus that much of your efforts on what we need to put in place to keep that smidge or whatever proportion of fossil-based infrastructure going until we just don't need it anymore. Nonetheless, if we don't get this right, there are some pretty significant impacts you would have to think for social license and for the way that people are experiencing this transition, right?
Can I hop on in that? Because I think you make a really good point about why isn't this being given more thought. My hot take theory on this is that it's because the people that could be well placed to hold forth with authority on kind of what the minimum viable scale of fossil fuel energy systems are the people that are running the fossil fuel energy systems.
Yeah, no shit. Like, and it's not really in their current interests, or at least they've just not given up the game yet, and interested in more active planning and management around phasing down and phasing out.
But it could even you don't even by all means you can jump to a nefarious motivation, but literally the humans with the expertise to do this are not working on these issues, right?
Absolutely. There's one passage in the sort of start of this paper that just really hit home, and I kind of want to read it out because it sort of goes to the complexity of these systems that have built up over time. So we've got this network of highly interdependent fossil fuel infrastructure. They've developed through decades-long processes of accretion and adjustment and gradually producing these the complex interdependencies. And they developed opportunistically and with limited coordination or documentation. And so the resultant network of networks rely on near universal coverage and the foundational expectation of long-term demand growth to support economies of scale. And so the whole premise of this paper is that as demand for those fossil fuels stagnates or declines, that those economies of scale are going to invert, and we're going to get to these points where, or beyond which, it won't be economical or feasible to keep this stuff going. And if your system has been like the whole show up till now, and there hasn't been all this work been put in to document all those very complex interdependencies, we could see some of these things kind of show up in unexpected ways as well as expected ways, which was interesting. So I guess it's a short paper, right? But it makes a really useful provocation in that, like, guys, we need to be thinking about this at the same time and planning in parallel for all the infrastructure that's replacing, the stuff that's going to be made redundant overall. It's making a point that there are increasing risks of rapid or kind of non-linear failures that will occur the closer we get to what they would define as these minimum, sort of viable scales. And I think, like, maybe one of the first observations that I would make, because they do talk about what that looks like in a couple of different areas, that's not at 10%. Necessarily, like at very low operating volumes of things like coal-fired power stations or fuel refineries. That could be very high percentages. So they talk about these constraints in three different areas. They talk about physical constraints, they talk about financial constraints, managerial constraints, so just that coordination piece. Yeah, and I thought some of the examples they gave here are really fascinating. So on the one hand, one of the areas they talk about are gas networks, which we're very much starting to have that conversation in Australia, right? Like that's a collective hobby horse, I'd say, of the three of us, that we've been talking about what happens when you have a shrinking, consumer base in the distributed gas network with fewer and fewer people to pay fixed network costs. Like, what happens there? That's something that we're thinking about. And
we've mostly spoken about that as one of these financial constraints, that the dynamic of fixed costs, operations and maintenance costs, but also the accumulated capital value of the network to be paid off, that those things fall on a smaller and smaller volume of demand, or actual customers actually disconnecting altogether, and you get a death spiral. But even that one, there are physical aspects to that situation as well. and the managerial aspect of coordination between different kinds of player and asset owner and system, where the drivers of different parts may fall apart. So we've had a bit of an entry into this, but we haven't thought about it so far in this broader context that Lappin and Grubert lay out.
Yeah, and so, like, I think the paper makes a rather compelling case to have a good long look at this, across the systems where we've got some of those ongoing dependencies. And so, I mean, I think, Tennant, to your sort of points there, we've probably had the most conversation about the gas network, say, so far. But we certainly haven't had, a sort of public-facing policymakers what to do about this in a considered way conversation for the equivalent case in petroleum refineries or necessarily coal, I guess the supply chains attached to coal mining and what that looks like. Like, the conversation has been very focused on transition and, of course, the imperative to reduce reliance on those assets and the commodities themselves. But there hasn't been a conversation around what you do when we're, I don't know, hopefully somewhere on a very steep adoption curve of EVs across the country, but our two fuel refineries that apparently maybe can't operate between below 65 or 70% capacity, face a risk into the future, like what to do when we're midway to that transition.
And so one of the things I thought about when reading this paper, which is it is a cracker, it's short, it's very digestible. Listeners, this is one where you could definitely knock it over yourself in a spare lunchtime. And then you'd have a very, very great difficulty concentrating on anything else that afternoon. One of the things that I thought of was we have lived through a few semi-chaotic, non-linear collapse episodes of fossil systems or fossil connected systems that didn't have anything to do with climate policy or transition in this country, that should make us feel like, actually, yes, this really is a dynamic worth thinking about. And the ones that occurred to me were the collapse of the vehicle assembly, like the car assembly industry in Australia, where you had a number of challenges, most acutely the period of a very strong exchange rate. You had the gradual exit of some assemblers, and then you had 3 left, and one of them went, and the remaining supply chain servicing them was no longer viable with the volume of demand from the remaining 2. And so they had to go or started to go, and therefore the last 2 assemblers opted to go. And there was other stuff going on. There was the government of the day sort of daring them to exit rather than throw more temporary but maybe permanent subsidies at them. But it was the non-linear collapse of an industrial ecosystem. And then the other, on the refinery front, we have 2 refineries left. They have been operating under basically a government guaranteed profit policy for the last few years to keep them around. They're old, they're subscale by modern standards. As the others have left, the chemicals industry around them and the plastics industry around them has significantly shrunk as well. What's left is very delicate indeed. And if there were to be a significant accident that caused damage to some of the major capital equipment, like a cracker at one of those remaining refineries, I don't think that facility would be reinvested in, and then some more industries connected to that would pass away too. All of which is to say, we are grappling without thinking it through in this particular framing, but we are grappling with these kind of issues. They're very live and real, and they're well worth thinking about and incorporating in a more realistic way, as the authors advise, into modelling and planning efforts that takes account of the physical and financial and managerial fragilities of these complex systems of systems.
So there's sort of two big ideas and two big calls to action I think are embedded in this paper. The first is kind of in terms of modelling and analysis that just assumes that as you smoothly scale up clean energy infrastructure, you can smoothly scale down the legacy fossil infrastructure and do that in kind of an incremental marginal way, and it'll just be apples.
Can anybody think of a major Australian energy policy process in which that particular fallacy is front and centre?
You can write in to mailbag@letmesumup.net if you feel like answering tenants.
Well, I can answer it because I'm not on the board of AEMO. The Integrated System Plan and its attitude to gas-fired electricity generation, which will cover all the gaps left over as fudge factor for the rest of the plan, even though this 13 gigawatts or whatever will be operating very little of the time and bearing the whole cost of sustaining the gas system to run once in a blue moon for 2 weeks at a time.
And the paper itself calls out that specific dynamic, right? Of the gas peaking, many people expect that to play a very significant role in supporting a high penetration renewable energy system over the next 2 or 3 decades. But it's sort of assuming that the existing gas network infrastructure is there and able to be accessed in a way that is not necessarily going to be as straightforward as is anticipated.
Yeah, and I mean, the other assumption, which just won't survive contact with reality, is that, as with most things, Tennant, you referred to the fuel refineries we've got are being heavily supported by government already. So, the idea that the economic model that's going to support that, the retention of that infrastructure won't involve some support from government. That's clearly a given. Now it just needs to be thought through, what makes sense and what that potentially looks like. I mean, the gas stuff is interesting, right? Because notionally we've got a future gas strategy. We've got GSUs, and actually kind of not dealing with these issues at all in any substantive way, right?
So 2 big ideas, 2 big calls to action. So the first one is effectively fix the modelling exercises and actually think through some of these breakpoints that you could hit in particular systems, which requires quite deep engagement with the fundamentals of those systems and their architecture and the kind of the underpinning physical and financial characteristics of those systems. So adding a huge amount of complexity to the exercise, but arguably really helpful complexity, because it sort of goes to the next big call to action, is it's not good enough just to model it and understand it. To the degree that you want to manage that transition, you need to step in and kind of handle what they call, it's effectively managerial risk, which is you've got, an ecosystem of decision makers who, if one of those entities forms the view that, doesn't make any sense anymore, I'm out, potentially the whole system collapses. And they give the example of the coal mines that supply coal-fired power stations in the US. If the coal-fired power stations become unviable because of the characteristics of demand for that particular form of generation in the market, the coal extraction capacity could then become unviable because of the kind of throughput that they need. Or vice versa, if the coal extraction becomes unviable because of a lack of demand, then that could form a cascade effect on that fossil infrastructure. And I can hear clean energy advocates listening to this saying, well, boo-hoo. that seems terrible. Not. But it could be pretty challenging if it disappears much earlier than you anticipate and the clean energy capacity isn't yet ready. And so that goes to the social license piece that you spoke to earlier, Frankie. It's about how you stage these things. And so in the paper, they say, well, government might need to actually get much more involved in kind of coordinating the decision-making of these complex systems and supporting like a smooth transition, because if we just leave it up to all of these different commercial entities to make decisions about what's in their interests, things could get very messy very quickly.
I wondered, so when you read this paper, to me there are sort of obvious opportunity areas. There are either policy making frameworks in place that could be leveraged to do this work more effectively, or bodies that could be tasked with things. Were there chunks of this that jumped out to either of you along those lines? Because, happy to chip one idea in. The Net Zero Economy Authority is kind of notionally the body that could be tasked with a broader kind of range of thinking along these lines. And, I think understandably it was established with a much more kind of tight scope of work. But actually, to me, it doesn't make any sense, really, having stood that up as a thing, that you wouldn't then look at tasking an entity like that with doing some of this thinking.
I think, conceptually, that makes all the sense in the world. As NZEA is currently constituted, I think they will be having their hands full just to manage the sort of industrial relations and the sort of regional economic ecosystem impacts of a narrow set of closures, and not necessarily get into or be able to get into the infrastructure and material flows and the deeper set of, or the not necessarily deeper. I mean, people are pretty deep. People matter, but the set of concerns that this paper has is not yet within NZEA's technical wheelhouse. But they're not really fitting neatly into anybody else's either. And if anybody's going to expand their capability to consider the potential for flow-ons of the chaotic collapse of one or another piece of the fossil energy systems that we have today, NZEA is as good as any and better than most. One additional thought on that, the many ways to try and manage this, I felt like, well, no, I don't want to impute particular solutions to the authors, but some people might leap to sort of nationalisation or state ownership of assets as a solution to this. There could be a lot of tools on the table, and you could combine a lot of those tools. So there are examples in more in the genre of what NZEA is trying to address around the smooth management of career changes or workforce changes for workers. But there are examples from Germany of taking a bunch of different and financially pressured coal mining for electricity businesses and consolidating them into a public entity, broader, private consolidation, vertical integration, or just incorporating these issues better into system planning. All of those could be parts of solutions, or sticking up for some of the ideas in last episode, you could better integrate signals for some of the things that are important here into the price signals facing markets. So if you were concerned, for instance, about Band-Aid bailout type interventions persisting or extending the use of high emissions technology beyond when we actually do need it, because, we already sunk this money into extending, say, a major coal-fired power station in New South Wales by a few more years, we might as well get some more value out of that by using it for a few years, even more than that. Well, that's a situation where it would be great to have commercial decisions facing a carbon constraint that could be weighed up alongside the cost of writing off capital or other disruptions. So there's a lot of tools on the table. People can argue about which ones are, the right ones for the job. It's hard to have that discussion unless you're recognising the fragilities that this paper is highlighting.
And I would also say, like, a huge opportunity, like, just to the point you kind of made around the experience Australia had with the kind of slow disintegration of auto manufacturing here, that there were these sort of industries or companies that were part of that extended supply chain that could no longer be held up without that kind of core base in place. Still, there are lessons in that for us, particularly when it comes to what we might be re-gearing some of these, like looking at it, the industries of the future, right? Like, we could be having a conversation on the other side around growing a green hydrogen or green ammonia based industries or export potentials, which would have some of the same applications, like Tennant, you were talking about the sort of chemicals and other industries that attach themselves to refineries, but could be operating with cleaner feedstocks. There feels like a pretty important opportunity to not let some of those businesses die on the way through. So just kind of taking that broader lens from that industry transformation perspective here is going to be really important. And I get that that's like the macro conversation we're having all the time, but I think reading papers like this puts a sharper point on, the sort of existential threat that can be faced when you get these really significant kind of disruptive events.
Yeah, well, this paper, I sort of knew this, but just reading it put a finer point on it. Like, there's so much effort being put into the economic, engineering and social license challenges of rolling out a high penetration renewable energy system. We need an equal amount of effort on the engineering and economic and social license issues of winding down a fossil fuel-based economy. Look, I think this is a really fascinating area. I think that if you were looking for a research area or an area of specialisation, taking the broad conceptual framework of this and actually looking deeply at particular sectors and systems and processes in Australia, saying, okay, we achieve net zero by 2050. What does that mean for X sector in Australia would be absolutely fascinating. And that is a paper I would like to read for this podcast.
This paper could have been titled just like most of the content here could have been under a title on just transition. But I think it has been focused more on the economic kind of side of the conversation that we're having here, like an economic logistics side. But a lot of the issues that we're talking about here are the basis of what advocates who focus on just transition kind of bang on about all the time. But it's coming at it more from it's coming at it from the people perspective. People's jobs, people's impact to livelihoods. It's just the other side of that coin, but it's the same coin.
A transition can't be just unless it doesn't blow up along the way.
No exploding transitions.
Please and thank you.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I am going to, theme in well with some of what we've been talking about and continue my record of being agitated about stuff to do with the enormous data centre boom that is taking shape in Australia, and note the recent report in the ABC that one major proposed data centre in New South Wales is proposed to be entirely powered by natural gas. So having gas backup is part of the game plan for many facilities, but this one would be using gas as plan A to avoid the need for a substantial dependency on the wider grid, electricity grid anyway. And so 700 megawatts of gas reciprocating engines would be part of the plan if this particular one gets up. Now, I don't want to over-focus on this one project, and we'll see if it actually happens, as we will with any of them. But it's certainly in the US, behind the meter gas is plan A for the majority of what's currently being developed. And if that were to happen here, making a whole bunch of assumptions about the utilisation of that facility, that one data centre itself would add something like 20 petajoules per annum to Eastern Australian gas demand in a context of about a 400 to 500 PJ future demand curve, and of course continuing anxiety about whether Australia might not have enough gas available in markets to meet local demand by the end of this decade. So it's a weird one. Would also add about a megatonne per annum to Australia's emissions. And I think that will intersect in a uncomfortable way with a whole range of debates that we're having about electricity system development, about gas security, about emissions. It would be a good idea to find different ways to meet whatever demand we have for AI services than what is currently understood about this kind of project. It remains to be seen if we will find different ways.
Indeed. Frankie, what have you got?
I am also going to double down on today's thematic and note with interest some broader shifts that look to, I think, a really helpful focus at a couple of levels on methane emissions in this country. You guys know I have been on this little hobby horse for a long time, and I'm not banging on here about household electrification. I am, however, noting that the National Climate Change Authority, in its final report last year, talked about the need to focus on methane emissions, and I think they're going to be doing some work this year on that, which I'm very interested in. And I also note, and I don't know if you guys have been following this, but in New South Wales, the EPA has been actively looking at whether it will seek to regulate ventilation air methane, so basically fugitive methane emissions from coal mining, more specifically underground coal mining in New South Wales. So I think there's certainly sort of more to play out on that front, but it is there's technology that is very commonly used and applied in other markets around the world, and Australia hasn't been an adopter of that technology yet en masse, and there's numerous reasons for it. But amongst other things, like it costs a lot to install and companies haven't been required to do it. So just to the broader point we've been making around pricing externalities appropriately, I think this presents a really intriguing sort of policy shift to watch at the state level, which you would have to think is kind of timed or may dovetail well with the federal review of the safeguard mechanism later this year. Lots of interesting stuff going on with methane, guys. I commit to all you dear listeners to well and truly stay on this hobby horse for the foreseeable future.
All right. For my one more thing, it is incumbent upon me to share a piece of voice note feedback we received from a human being that for some reason regards himself as having standing to comment on our comments on the Superpower Institute's recent blockbuster report, the case for pricing pollution.
Who is this jumped up blow-in?
Yeah.
Hi gang, it's Bathan Mullen, CEO of the Summerupperers Institute.
Oh,
Thanks to the Let Me Sum Up team for what we thought was a very fair and balanced assessment of the work, the case for pricing pollution.
Buttering us up.
Frankie, we tend to agree this could have been two papers.
I knew it.
What connects them is the set of issues that we're trying to solve: climate, budget, and economic prosperity. And both policies have some role here. Ultimately, everyone looking at emissions reduction policy should be able to agree we want to do this as efficiently as possible. So we're putting forward one way we think is close to optimal: the polluter pays.
Two ways, Bathan.
We do think the revenue-raising potential from the PPL is hard to ignore. The spending pressures in all areas of the budget show no sign of slowing, and we need to continue to invest in the energy transition and the industries that will provide well-paying jobs and economic prosperity for the decades to come. Continuing with the current arrangements gives up a significant opportunity to do that. So can the safeguard mechanism be reformed and do that job? Well, we have our doubts. But as Tennant's idea of the safeguard of Theseus is not a bad way to look at it. There is a possibility that we can change it so much that it starts to look very much like what we're proposing, or something that can achieve emissions reductions very efficiently. But a question for you all: if the safeguard is changed such that it looks very much like a carbon price across the economy, even if it isn't called that, how will this play politically? Is it going to be any less exposed to the kind of scare campaign that is widely feared? Thanks again for the episode. We look forward to you continuing to cover the debate. Cheers, guys.
well, there is a scare campaign against the safeguard mechanism as it stands. And there will be a scare campaign against any possible changes to the safeguard mechanism short of abolishing it. Like, does that campaign have any traction as of now? Does anybody care? I don't think so. It might have traction and people might care with more easily attacked substantive changes. You don't know.
Well, I guess the question is, as a matter of pure politics, putting aside the substance, is one better than the other? Is there any advantage in kind of chucking the existing regime out and doing something big and new and shiny versus, a more incremental or reformist approach to the safeguard?
Speaking as a soft-headed, mushy-hearted centrist, I think that there is an intuitive appeal to a significant but not infinite cohort of people from being able to truthfully say, we're taking what we've got and we are evolving it and amending it bit by bit, but change will be considered and gradual and involve familiar elements. That sounds a bit conservative, but like a progressive conservative, which used to be a whole party in Canada.
I don't disagree with Tennant, but I also think for those of us that have been in these wars for a long time, it would behoove us to make sure we're doing the reality check with all the affected stakeholders out there. If there is indeed I think it's important to understand where would a scare campaign come from. Is there likely to be, just understand what the landscape is before you presume to make a decision or kind of engage in a certain way. And in the broader kind of business community these days, like, I think there's pretty good appetite for the conversation around carbon pricing. It exists in a shadow form inside of pretty much every listed company in this country. So I wouldn't want us to go down this path kind of assuming that there's no appetite for a discussion about more substantive reform here without asking that question. So I think that's the only other flourish I would add to Tennant's point.
All right. Well, thanks both. I appreciate the thoughts and the kind words. It was a good report. I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation. If you have feedback and are the CEO of an organisation of a report that we've covered on the podcast, or not, just anyone.
Don't get so hoity-toity, Luke. We want to hear from everyone. CEOs need not apply. You can, of course, visit letsumeup.net and there is a voice notes tab at the top of the page. Share your thoughts and we might play them on the pod. We're almost done, but we are a podcast that values our supporters, our Patreons, our subscribers on Apple Podcasts, and as a result, we do record the odd bit of bonus content at the end of the show, and we are doing so again today. A long-awaited piece of bonus content, I might add. Tennant, what do our beloved supporters have to look forward to this week?
Like the Holy Grail, shimmering and sparkling in a vision at the end of an epic quest, the resources sector decarbonisation plan is the one that we will finally sum up. Is the sixth bowl of porridge the one that is just right? Or is it a claggy bowl of gruel that will be ashes in our mouths? You can find out only one way. Well, maybe two ways. You could read the thing, but if you don't want to have to do that, you could subscribe to this here podcast. You
can totally subscribe, and if you may be sick of hearing us bang on about sector plans, but if that was your view, you would be mistaken, because there's an actual proper expert joining us to opine on the resources sector plan. Dr. Mary Stewart is joining us on the podcast this week, and no one better placed to give a hot or not to the resources sector plan and its decarbonisation bona fides.
I look forward to whacking this one in the microwave until it comes back to temperature.
So run, don't walk to letsumeup.net. Click support LMSU on the top of the page. You'll find your way to our Patreon and to that sweet, sweet BOCO. That is our show for today. This podcast was edited by energy professional podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, you like promoting things. What would you like to promote today?
Ooh, well, I think it's still sort of, can we call this the start of a new year? It's not. But we can't. No, we can't. Okay.
It's March.
Okay.
We've had a ruling.
All right. Okay, fine. I have to give that up. What I would observe, though, is that we haven't had that many recommendations for papers to read come in from our dear listeners lately. And as you all know, we do pretty well at sourcing some of those ideas ourselves, but it is really nice to hear from listeners on what you're most interested to hear us talk about. So I'm going to do a classic pitch here, guys, for people to write in or send a voice note or, as is usually the case, text whichever one of us you know the best and harass us with your ideas for what paper we should read in the next little while. Do it. Do it now.
Do it now. I think that's a great idea. Again, letsumeup.net for all your communication needs. I mean, you can text us if you want. Maybe it won't get lost in the flurry of text messages. I recommend submitting your paper ideas via the website. For Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I hope that appeal for papers leads to a Miracle on 34th Street style scene a few episodes from now, where we announce the delivery of 5, 6, 7 sacks of papers, all addressed to, well, not Santa Claus, but this podcast.